Joining me now in our Canberra studio, the Greens leader Bob Brown to discuss the government's compromise plan on climate change. Senator Brown, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Kieran.
Oxfam says it welcomes the government's compromise proposal. That today it said it's good to see the government acknowledge that developing countries should not have to commit to binding economy-wide emissions reduction targets. Can you see their point, that developing countries should not be kept on the same playing field as developed countries?
Well, that may be a point. We'll be interested to see whether the government adopts Oxfam's call for much more than $100 billion to go to developing countries. That's stage two, $3 or $4 billion from Australia. But that's not what this government, Rudd government or Penny Wong, is about. They're about trying to substantiate their weak target of 5%, which has led the developing countries to say, well, that's not doing anything real. Why should we? And the Penny Wong and Kevin Rudd are into saying, well, you do what you like now, because certainly we can't logically want you having big binding targets coming out of this meeting if we're not prepared to do it ourselves. It's a convenience for this government to get it off the hook by saying to developing countries, we expect less of you.
Isn't it convenient for you, though, to focus on the 5% target when the government has said it's willing to go up to 25% if there's an agreement? So you're focusing on the 5%, but that's mandatory. 25% is the potential.
Well, that's 25% is a bottom line for what the world scientists are saying, which needs to be 40%, not 25. It is a weak target, whichever way you look at it, and that 25% comes with unacceptable. That comes with really unacceptable provisos being dictated to those developing countries, and they're saying we won't have a bar of it. So it isn't a real 25% that the government's talking about, and if it were, it's way below the level which 40 scientists have again today petitioned governments to go to, which is 40%, if you're going to, for example, save the Great Barrier Reef.
Oxfam also said that developing countries, this is their response to the government's proposal today, they said developing countries are still bringing much of their populations out of poverty and have to be flexible with how they are going to contribute to emissions reductions. Isn't what Penny Wong is saying is exactly that developing countries should be given the flexibility on how they respond?
Well, it's a big turnaround because the Howard government and then the Rudd government were all saying if countries like China aren't prepared to step up and sign binding agreements with tough emissions cuts, then why should we? And this is what big business in Australia, the big polluters have been saying. Why should we meet tough targets if the developing countries aren't doing it? Suddenly they've dropped that. And that's because the developed countries, and particularly Australia, are not prepared to face up to tough targets because the big polluters don't want to do that. This has been described in today's Australian, amongst other papers, as a circuit breaker. It's really heartbreaking. We have to be addressing a planetary crisis of our own making due to climate change. It's not something that's going to happen. It's happening now. We saw the dire predictions about worse bushfires in New South Wales just yesterday. We know what happened last summer. We know what's happening to the Murray-Darling Basin, and yet get together, get Australian politicians over to an international conference and they start dissembling and start saying to other people, well, you don't have to meet the standards we were calling for domestically, because otherwise we can't meet the standards you want, which are the sort of targets that the world scientists are calling for.
Aren't they trying to be realistic to a degree in what they can achieve? It's only 80 days or so until the Copenhagen summit. I mean, what else can they hope to achieve?
Realistically, Kieran, we are facing climate change with massive economic penalties, hundreds of millions of people on the move in coming decades, great food shortages.
But can an agreement be reached? You know as well as I do that the Doha trade rounds collapsed. International agreements are very difficult. What sort of agreement can be reached?
I think we would be getting a much better run towards an agreement if Australia was prepared to take the sort of targets the scientists are saying, 25 to 40%. We would be then leading to a position where the developing countries would be really stepping up to the plate and saying we will do more. As it is, Kevin Rudd and Penny Wong are saying, well, we'll make it much easier. You do what you can, because we don't want you dictating tougher targets, realistic targets, scientifically based targets to us.